In April of 1943, a plane known as the Lady Be Good took to the skies over Libya for a military mission in Naples, Italy. Later that evening, communication abruptly stopped, and the whereabouts of the plane and its crew wouldn't be known for almost 2 decades. When it was finally learned what happened, it was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. This is the disturbing disappearance of the Lady Be Good, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. On April 4th, 1943, the world was in the midst of World War II, and it was still more than 2 years away from coming to an end. On a small airstrip known as Saluj near Benghazi, Libya, pilot William Hatton sat in a brand new airplane that was about to take off for its first ever flight with a crew of 9 aboard. William's B-24D Liberator aircraft was one of 28 belonging to the US being sent on a bombing mission over Naples, Italy that day. His plane was assigned to the second of a 2-wave attack, so Williams would be one of the last planes to take off from Saluj that day, and the instructions for the mission were simple. Take off, fall into formation with the planes ahead of them, and bomb strategic targets in the Italian harbor to cut off supplies and reinforcements from coming into Naples. It's less often discussed when the topic of World War II comes up, but North Africa was a critical theater for both Allied and Axis forces. Fighting in the region began in June of 1940 and continued until 1943, with almost 400,000 combined casualties for both sides in the campaign. The area's geographic location made it strategically important for the Allies to control access into, out of, and over the Mediterranean Sea, and countries like Libya, Algeria, and Egypt were perfectly positioned for launching aerial campaigns to keep Axis powers from concentrating around the Mediterranean. In fact, had the Allies not won control of North Africa, the all-important invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943 that led to the fall of the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini may have never occurred. Now, the US military's favorite tool for aerial attacks was the very plane William was piloting, which was a heavy bomber aircraft with an exceptionally long flight range and the ability to cruise at high speeds. The Liberator was such a beloved plane that it still holds the record as the most produced bomber in American military aircraft history. At least, the generals loved it. This is likely because of its ability to fly great distances on a single load of fuel while carrying a heavy bomb load. Airmen, on the other hand, much preferred the roomier B-17s because comparatively, the B-24 had lower ceilings and much less free space, but this is also part of what made it such an efficient aircraft. Compared to others, it also featured what is known as the Davis wing, which produced much less drag. After World War II, the use of this Davis wing came to an end, but it served its purpose in helping make the Liberator the US military's aircraft of choice during the war. As good as the B-24 was, however, the conditions on April 4th weren't cooperating enough to call the mission to Naples routine. Winds were strong, and despite sitting relatively close to the Libyan coast, Saluj was prone to sandstorms. This caused visibility to be greatly reduced by all the sand in the air, and after the first wave of B-24Ds took off, many of their pilots decided it was unsafe to continue on. As those planes turned around to head back to Saluj, William's plane, which was nicknamed the Lady Be Good, took to the skies for the first time and got onto its course toward Italy. As the plane headed in the direction of where William expected the formation to be, he heard pilot after pilot come on the radio to report that they were returning to Saluj because the conditions were so poor that they threatened the functionality of the aircrafts. This is because sandstorms present a type of danger to planes that regular storms don't. Because sand is coarse and rough, it can be abrasive and cause damage to everything from windscreens to engines. William, however, believed the Lady Be Good was holding up nicely despite conditions, so he and the crew pressed on alone. Then, just 30 minutes from reaching Naples, he didn't like how the engines were performing and he knew that the sand was to blame. Just like the 27 others who were part of the mission, William decided to turn the plane around and head back to Saluj. Almost as soon as the Lady Be Good was pointed to the south, its automatic direction finder stopped working. This failed piece of equipment is critical in the navigation of an airplane because it constantly displays the plane's heading. Ironically, it was a problem not caused by the sandstorm, but it was a major issue nonetheless. And located more than 700 miles or 1,100 kilometers to the southeast of Naples, Saluj would be nearly impossible to find if William had no idea what direction the plane was pointing. In better conditions, the crew would navigate by sight using landmarks on the ground, but there was no chance of that happening during a sandstorm in and around Libya. Since Saluj was located in the northern portion of the country, the Libyan shoreline with the Mediterranean Sea would have been about the best landmark the men could have hoped for, since cities are sparse in the area. In fact, even today, the region has few established towns and cities because it's an area dominated by the vast, barren Sahara Desert. It's unclear exactly why officials and radio operators made the decisions they did that night, but either way, it would result in the plane not getting navigational help. And soon enough, not only was a sandstorm still causing visibility problems in the region, but night had long since fallen, making flying by sight all the more difficult. In the end, the Lady Be Good never did find Saluch that night, and when crew stopped replying to radio operators, US military officials in North Africa feared the worst. Early the next day, a search and rescue mission was launched, but no one even knew where to look as the plane's last known location was over the Mediterranean Sea. This is when the automatic direction finder stopped working. Then, finally, when it was clear the plane and its crew were unlikely to be found, the US military reported that it was operating under the assumption that the Lady Be Good went down in the Mediterranean Sea and that all 9 of the men aboard were presumed dead. And with that, the military considered the matter closed. By 1958, the world's growing dependence on fossil fuels had created a race among oil companies to locate new and more fruitful drilling sites, and North Africa just happened to have an abundance of them. During a scouting flight over Libya, several British geologists working for an oil company looked out their windows for any signs of oil when one of them spotted some sort of debris field below. This was then pointed out to the others, and the pilots circled the area at a low altitude so they could get a better look at what it was. And it didn't take long for them to figure out that it was the remains of an airplane that had clearly crashed there. Since it appeared to be a military plane, the pilot contacted Wheelus Air Force Base in Libya about the discovery, but initially there was little interest in it from officials there. They had no record of a missing plane, so the discovery was more or less none of their concern. Over the following months, more and more surveys of the area were conducted by geologists, one of which happened to be a good friend of the commander at the same airbase. After inspecting the crash site from the ground one of these times, the geologist wrote a letter to the commander with detailed information about what he observed from the crash site, including maintenance records and crew names found on clothing still inside the plane. Then, in cross-checking the names, Wheelus officials finally realized the importance of the find. A military investigation team was then sent to the coordinates of the crash site in May of 1959, 6 months after the wrecked plane was first reported, and it was indeed the Lady Be Good. Many years earlier, when William called into Saluch for help that night in 1943, radio operators made a crucial mistake. Rather than providing verbal instructions right from the get-go, instead, during the sandstorm in the middle of the night, Saluch officials decided to fire off a series of flares in hopes that the Lady Be Good would spot them. Obviously, while well-intentioned, the plane wasn't able to see the flares. William then unknowingly flew right past the airstrip and continued south. For 2 hours after the plane overshot the airstrip, communications between the crew and the ground were kept up after officials realized that maybe flares weren't the best idea. Verbal guidance then began in hopes of getting the plane on the ground somehow, but it was too late by that point. The plane had been flying in an unknown direction for too long, and no one on the ground or in the air knew where it was. Then, suddenly, the plane's radio went silent and all attempts to re-establish contact failed. The best anyone could figure was that the plane and its crew were lost in the Mediterranean Sea. In reality, the Lady Be Good overshot Saluch by 440 miles to the south, and the military was correct in that the plane did go down in the sea, but it wasn't in the Mediterranean. Instead, the plane skidded to a stop in the heart of the Kalanshio Sand Sea. This area is an astounding 24,000 square miles of arid, inhospitable land. There's no water, no vegetation, no shade, and very little wildlife that could be considered food. When the investigation team arrived many years later and began a thorough search of the crash site, there was a curious absence of human remains or activity in the area. Curiously as well, the plane itself was in surprisingly good condition. A further examination then revealed that when it crashed in the desert, it did so without a drop of fuel in its tanks. 3 of the 4 propellers were also rippled, indicating that they weren't operational at the time of impact, and there was no sign of an explosion or fire, so it would have been completely survivable. The crewmen, however, weren't in the plane when it went down, as evidenced by the lack of parachutes in the Lady Be Good. It was then realized that they must have bailed from the aircraft before it crashed, and they could have been anywhere when that happened. The investigation team then expanded its search area outside the crash site, and around 19 miles or 31 kilometers to the north, the first sign of the crew was found. Sitting in the middle of the desert were half-buried parachutes and a pair of rubber flight boots with their toes forming an arrow pointing northward. But despite now having some indication of where the crew of the Lady Be Good might have gone, nothing further was found in the initial search. For 3 months afterward, investigators continued to look for the remains of the men until desert sand started to cause their vehicles and other equipment to fail. So, just like in 1943, the US military closed the book on the Lady Be Good and assumed the bodies of the 9 men had been buried in the sand after 15 years of exposure to desert elements. Another 6 months passed after the search was called off when oil company employees made another shocking discovery during a scouting flight.